aquesta sessió, benvinguts en aquesta sessió extraordinària de seminaris del GRESIB, no? Que n'hem tingut dues de molt seguidetes. Avui la presentació, el seminari, el conduirà James Ramsburg, que actualment és un estudiant de doctorat i professor d'espanyol del Departament d'Estudis Hispànics i Portuguesos de la Universitat de Minnesota Twin Cities, i a més també ha col·laborat amb el Centre de Recerca Avançada en Adquisició de Llengües d'aquesta mateixa universitat. Actualment és col·laborador del GRESIB i ha fet una estada de recerca que aviat s'acabarà, però de 3 mesos, a la Universitat de les Illes Balears. Té dues àrees principals de recerca, que són el contacte de llengües, és a dir, què passa quan els parlants de diverses llengües es troben i s'influeixen mútuament, i l'adquisició de la llengua, és a dir, com els parlants adquireixen llengües en contextos naturalistes i educatius. Actualment, però, el seu treball se centra sobretot a descriure i explicar la variació dialectal, especialment en el lèxic, i tot i que gran part de la seva recerca fins ara l'ha conduïda en espanyol, també s'interessa per diverses llengües, com és ara el català, especialment en el català balear, que és el focus de la seva tesi doctoral, però també l'occità aranès, el quítxua i altres llengües maies. Avui parlarà sobretot de metodologies i generalment fa un enfocament variacionista i cognitivista, si bé també ha incorporat la dialectometria a la seva recerca. Llavors, la combinació d'aquests enfocaments és el que d'alguna manera li permet desenvolupar la seva tesi doctoral sobre el canvi lèxic a Mallorca i és el que presentarà avui en el seminari titulat The Lexical Choices of Majorcan Youth, a Methodological Proposal for the Study of Dialect Change. Quan vulguis, James, pots compartir pantalla i tens tota l'hora per explicar-nos-ho.
Well, gracias, Elga. Perfect. Hello, everyone. Wonderful. This is weird. We haven't spoken in English. Most of the people in this room, we don't speak in English. This is odd. But hello and welcome. So as Elga mentioned in the introduction, today is a discussion of what I've been doing here for the last 3 months, which I think many people have heard about a little bit. Sort of know what I'm doing, and then this will be the whole long full explanation of that. And again, as Elga mentioned, I'm doing a study right now on the lexical choices of Majorcan youth, and so seeing how or how not they maintain the traditional Majorcan Catalan lexicon and how that's affected by language contact and other factors. Okay, so let's get started. Muy bien. There we go. Vale, so as a bit of an introduction, minimize that. Majorcan Catalan and Balearic Catalan in general have long been thought to be very unique, very conservative dialects of the language. Archaic is often used as well. But the question that I posed at the beginning of this project is that still true? And to what extent? Because now Majorca, the Majorca of the past is not the Majorca of today. And Majorca today is situated in a rapidly globalizing world. And then this American society has changed radically over the past 60 years, especially. And so, since these social and linguistic realities have changed and have changed pretty drastically, although that has happened, the depictions of Majorcan Catalan have not, and especially at the lexical level, where we don't have a lot of new lexical data, and I'll be going over all of that. So, here's what we'll talk about, what I'll talk about in my talk today, a bit of background, on dialect change, talk about Majorcan Catalan, talk about what the evidence we have, and then what I've been doing so far. So the purpose of my study is to provide a comprehensive contemporary account of the state of the Majorcan Catalan lexicon with an emphasis on the lexical choices of young people. Ultimate goal being then to determine the degree of lexical maintenance or shift, and identify the linguistic factors and social factors that govern those processes, right? That explain why some words are maintained and why others are lost. And it will, I hope to provide, right, a comprehensive overview of the state of the Majorcan Catalan lexicon, something that's desperately needed, with special attention given to the effects of language contact. And so that's contact with Spanish and with standard Catalan, we'll say Central Catalan, and the maintenance and loss of these items. And why is this relevant? It's relevant because in contrast to traditional dialectological studies, which I argue have been largely subjective in at least analytical nature, the data will be analyzed in a different way, and that's via two computational methods, one being from dialectometry and the other being from variation of sociolinguistics. We'll get into that and why I think those are useful methods. And it's also relevant just because there is a lack of recent empirical data about the current state of the Majorcan Catalan lexicon. So a bit of background. Obviously, for most people in this room, this is a bit basic, but these are the dialects of Catalan, right? You can split it into two main blocks, Western and Eastern. Balearic Catalan forms part of the Eastern block. And then as subdialect of that is Majorcan, right? Spoken, of course, on the island of Majorca. I will talk a bit about de-dialectalization or dialect leveling, which I think for the purposes of this presentation, we can understand those as synonyms. And essentially it's the process by which a dialect begins to converge over time with a standard variety. And there's various factors that affect that. Vang in 1986 listed some of those out. Human displacement, meaning immigration and immigration, prestige of the standard, mockery being if the local variety is associated with irony, right, used to mock people, and then cultural decay, which that's a very severe term, but it just means I wouldn't say cultural modernization. For example, words used out in the country, right? Now, as people shift away from agriculture to other ways of life, those words associated with agriculture are lost. But that's again due to cultural change. Maybe not decay, but change. Right. So, language and dialect contact in general. So many people have studied language and dialect contact, many linguists over the past century or so, and they all have different views and theories as to how and why it happens. And so which factors are most important, whether they're social, behavioral, structural, psycholinguistic, cognitive, creative, etc. But one thing they have generally in common is when we look at the hierarchy of change. So what changes first in a given context situation? And so you can see at the bottom, over time and with the intensity of contact, usually the lexicon we see changes first, then phonetics and phonology, and then morphosyntax. And again, that makes sense. The lexicon, we're talking about open class items. Morphosyntax is closed class. Morphosyntax is more deeply maybe embedded into the structure of a language. It's easier to change a word than a grammatical feature. But again, these are general trends. I don't speak a lot about universals, but these are general trends that we see, and I think it makes conceptual sense. But it is important to note for later on is that the lexicon in a given situation tends to change first. Great. So let's give a brief overview of Majorcan Catalan itself. Why is it so unique? Generally, it can be explained historically, right? Based off repeated colonization by different historical powers. You see those at the bottom of the screen. Hispanicization in general increased in the 18th century in certain reduced circles, right? Literary, administrative, and academic circles. And knowledge of Spanish, passive knowledge at least, since we're looking at 16th century, some part of the educated urban population, but majority population of America was not bilingual. Bilingual as we understand it today, as Catalan and Spanish simultaneous bilinguals, until the 20th century. Right. As for a bit of demographic context, beginning in the 60s, what caused this radical change in American society was the development of the tourism sector. That brought a couple of things, brought industrialization, and it brought demographic change, because when you, to build the tourism sector was done through immigration largely, at least in the first wave, from the peninsula. And so that's largely Spanish monolinguals from Andalusia. However, that trend did change. So that was your first wave, was from the peninsula. And then as of, let's say, in 2014, of immigration, 61% of immigrants were from Catalan speaking areas, 17% from other areas of the peninsula, where there's the Spanish state, and then 23% from other countries. And so immigration now is much more varied than it was in that first wave. Generally, linguistically speaking, and making quite large generalizations, immigrants in general may be characterized by slow and often incomplete linguistic integration in language communities. That's especially true for those immigrants who speak Spanish upon arrival. And then there was one study done by Balearic and Mestre from 2007 that 70% of foreign immigrants in their sample to the Balearic Islands did not know that Catalan existed before they came. Great. As for linguistic competencies and use, knowledge of Catalan remains relatively high. And so knowledge being, again, being able to understand, speak, read, and write are relatively high, especially among young people who have gone through school in Catalan. Of course, your older generation, we look at something like reading and writing, those dip a little bit, but generally high competencies. And when we look at habitual language use, it's a bit of a different story. Here it's sort of small, but the red bar is Spanish and the blue bar is Catalan. You can see that in most areas, and this is across the all of the Balearic Islands and Palma on its own, Spanish outpaces Catalan in habitual use, except for outside of Palma in Mallorca, which is we see slightly higher use of Catalan, and then in Menorca, right? And of course, we see over in Navis and Formentera over here, Spanish outpacing Catalan habitual use quite markedly. So what are some characteristics of American Catalan that make it so unique, some of its unique features? We'll go through by a different level of language. So starting with morphosyntax, couple things. We have the articles salats, which is S and sa, used, well, a mixed system, right, between literary articles and salat articles. Conservation of the old personal article, an and na, the use of weak possessive pronouns, right, mon, ma, ton, ta, instead of the standard el, meu, y la meva. And then zero dissonance of the first person singular of the present. So instead of things like jo canto, or jo, right, jo lomb, it's jo canto, jo dorm, jo dorm, in those first person. As for phonics and phonology, there's some elision of schwa in IAE groups, words with antepenultimate stress. So things like familia was family, historias, histories, is glazi. Distinction between B and V is maintained, but and the. The pronunciation of the TL consonant cluster is slightly different, and then the elision of intervocalic S in some words, right? So instead of camisa, camilla, great. And of course, one of the most salient features of Majorcan Catalan, and actually larger Balearic Catalan in general, is the maintenance of the old standard 8-stressed vowel system, where you have the schwa there. So instead of things like let's see, pasech, it's pasach, right? Great. And then lexicons. This is where we're most important. Sumerian lexicon is mainly composed of the Eastern Catalan lexicon of the 13th century. And then according to Veng 1982 in Satsanals para las Catalans, he says that 95% of its core vocab is shared with Central Catalan, and then 65% of its non-core vocab is shared with Central Catalan. So, and that's that difference there is likely due to the conservation of archaisms. And there's also many loan words from from other languages as well, Arabic and Spanish being some of them. Great. So that's, what we know, at least written down. Now, what do we have for evidence of maintenance and change, which is scarce, but there is some. For maintenance, Doles and Wheeler in 1995, and there's an asterisk there because it's been, 25 years or more, but they did find that first-person singular morphology, that zero dissonance was maintained. So things like jo cant was maintained among all groups of speakers. Although I think anecdotally that is also maintained, at least to some degree. I've heard it while I've been here, so it's maintained to some degree. But shift, and so these are all from Montoya Abad in 2002. Shift away from the simple past to the periphrastic past. Your order of clinic pronouns is changing. Traditionally, it should be direct object, then indirect object. That's inverted now to be more like Central Catalan, more like Standard Catalan. And then definite articles, modifications to that system. So loss of so and sos, and then a generalization of s and sa, because of course, as we mentioned before, there's a dual system of literary articles and the salat articles. Even in spoken speech, some reference will only use a literary article, but you see generalization where if you're using articles salats, they're being generalized to be able to refer to all reference instead of just some. For phonetics and phonology, maintenance of dissimulation of sibilants and contacts, that is definitely maintained, and I definitely hear that quite often. Things like letseats and piscina, right, instead of piscina, y las cis. And then recently, Doles found hypercorrection in some formal contexts of actually that of the dissimulation of consonants, dissimulation of sibilants and contact, simulation of point of articulation and coda stops, and then stress schwa as well, in which there was a correction of the stress schwa. Instead of passage, it would be actually passage, right, as you would see in Central Catalan. So we'll see. So there's definitely register effects as well. And as of the lexicon, that's where we have the most scarce amount of data. And so there's a general lack of studies of lexical change, and contemporary dialectological works that mention the lexicon seem to just emphasize its conservative, archaic nature. So it lists maybe some of its unique old words that are from Old Catalan, and that's really all you get in most dialectological works. An exception to that is the works of Jaume Corbera, who have for many years now warned or decried the changes perhaps happening to the Majorcan Catalan lexicon in certain ways. And then if we look at very recent studies, there's only two senior theses, right? So try final de grau, which I would consider to be contemporary works, objective empirical works that look at just the lexicon. And one is 2013 from Ramsburg, who looked in Sawyer and found that some traditional words were maintained across age groups, but there was a marked loss of Gallicisms among younger speakers, Gallicisms being a feature of Soyeric, which is the local dialect of Majorcan Catalan, a local variety of Majorcan Catalan. And then later in Bodas Morell in 2019, looking at a study of Campanet, found that traditional words were maintained by older speakers, but some traditional words were unrecognizable by younger speakers. So there is shift happening. And these are obviously very small studies looking at only one place and relatively, small senior theses, but we see evidence of shift. But that's all we have. That's all we empirically know currently. Okay. And as for factors in general, what are the factors that are implicated in these processes? It seems that Majorca is no exception to general sociolinguistic trends. So things like age, sex, gender, and geographical location are important factors, right? Young women in urban areas are often the leaders of change. But there are some context-specific factors, things like literacy and educational level, right? The higher level of education, the lower level of maintenance of traditional variety, proliferation of electronic media, mean now exposure to other language varieties on TV and on your phone and on the computer has an impact in your own personal variety of speech, individual mobility and demographic change, emigration and immigration, well, that's personal of the speaker itself or new speakers coming to that speaker's speech community. And then language attitudes and ideologies, which of course we know are very important. So, great. So in general, what do these results suggest? The results that we have so far, and this is not only my conclusion, but conclusions of other authors, is that Majorcan Catalan is likely undergoing a long-term de-dialectalization process that would culminate in greater assimilation to standard Central Catalan and Spanish. And those changes are seen to be occurring at all levels of the language, although perhaps the lexicon may be more affected than previously believed, just because we need a little more research on it. And the reasons for this are varied, but demographic, educational, ideological factors appear to be the most influential. Okay, so that's what we know so far. Great, and I'm on track. Perfect. So what am I doing now? I'm proposing with my dissertation is another method for doing dialectology. So we'll get into that. When we look at traditional dialectological sampling and analysis, so how dialectology traditionally is done in dialectology, which of course I believe we all know, but that's the study, right, of geographic variation of a variety, of a dialect or of a language. What we have here is and this is a quote from Macaulay in 2017, is the aim of many early dialect surveys was to collect information about forms of speech that might disappear because of social changes, and they were looking for examples of the uncorrupted folk speech of a given locality. which sums up, I think, pretty well traditional dialectological aims, which are in documentation. Is to document speech varieties, and generally documenting speech varieties under the pressure of thinking these speech varieties are going to be lost. And that's where we get the acronym NORM from, which is non-mobile, older, rural males. And that was seen as being the ideal archetype for a participant or an informant in a dialect survey or in a dialectological study, because those were seen as being the individuals who would be most resistant to language change. And so they would represent the purest, again, uncorrupted folk speech that you were looking for. And that's traditional. And again, to be fair, dialectology has come a long way from that, and dialectology now is done in a variety of ways. But this is the most traditional ways of doing it, right? You'd go out and you'd find these speakers that you would consider to be the purest speakers of a language, and you would try and document how they were speaking, right? Through a survey or through an interview, a recording, something like that. In terms of types of sampling, it's varied. Generally, random sampling is hard to do. Again, if you're looking for very specific types of speakers that fit a very narrow demographic window, doing pure random sampling is very hard. So you're not getting a lot of random sampling. Today, some random sampling does happen. And then in terms of analysis, traditional dialectological studies do a lot of general descriptions, because again, that was their point, was to offer sometimes the first description of a dialect and counts, right? Because traditional dialectology is very descriptive. I mean, it's empirical and objective in that it's collecting data, right? It's not using invented speech, it's collecting actual real world data. But how that's analyzed would either be just offering general description, right? Taking out the features, or offering counts. So if you were counting, you would just offer frequencies of those terms. And that's as far as a lot of traditional analysis would go. And that's why I say subjective, because analysis in that case would be more qualitative, supplemented maybe with some counts. Now, if we look at the limitations of traditional dialectological methods, I'd say there's two. And one is with analyst perceptions and with isoglosses. So analyst perceptions, I would say, being the influence of an analyst's perception, right? The linguist's perception in the study. Being that when you are having maybe a more qualitative analysis or subjective analysis of usually a lot of data, what can happen is you can overestimate or underestimate the importance of certain features, or the degree of maintenance or loss of certain features, if you're just trying to do that based on your own perceptions. And of course, one's own language ideology is getting in the way, etc. And two being isoglosses. So isoglosses are the lines that are drawn in dialect maps. So when we have dialect maps, what separates those into dialect areas are called isoglosses. And those traditionally are obviously done by hand with a lot of care and knowing the data deeply, of course, but they are purely subjective, right? You are drawing a line on a map and dividing varieties into different areas. And those have been obviously heavily critiqued for their validity. Of course, I think it's obviously, you can't draw a line on a map and know that on one side they speak a certain way and the other side they speak a different way. So there's issues with isoglosses and their general validity. Okay. So knowing that, when I sat down and knew that I wanted to study the Majorcan Catalan lexicon because it's a hole in the research and an interesting context situation, I thought about, how am I going to do this? And this is the method that I came up with, was two parts. So in terms of sampling, in terms of data collection, there would be three parts, and that'd be a sociolinguistic questionnaire that involves biographic information and then a language profile, a written dialect questionnaire / field interview, right? And then a feature recognition or judgment task. So those would be your data collection methods. One, to get social variables, which is a sociolinguistic questionnaire, but to get your social variables, to get language use, to get language ideologies, important factors. The dialect questionnaire or field interview to get the actual linguistic variables you're looking for, or the linguistic feature under investigation, and then feature recognition and judgment to weed out whether or not, okay, is is loss or change of that item due to language contact, or is it due to they just don't know what that feature is, or they now consider that feature to be ungrammatical, etc. So feature recognition, I think, is an important final piece to that data collection. And then in terms of analysis, two ways: for visualization, a dialectometric analysis, and then for explanation, a mixed effects variable rules analysis for explanation. And I will now get into all of this using the example of my study of Majorcan Catalan lexicon. But my proposed method and what I want to do with my dissertation is essentially offer a first test of seeing if this can be a useful methodology that can then be operationalized for other linguistic features. So not just for the Majorcan Catalan lexicon, but for all types of situations of dialect change, and seeing if this is a useful method and an easily reproducible method. Okay. That's the ultimate goal, is to create a package, more or less, that can be used by other researchers to have a easily reproducible and standardized way of studying dialect change. That's useful, because that's one of the things about doing dialectology, is that it's hard, in that it takes a lot of work, usually takes a lot of time, that generally requires money, and the logistics of it all, and a big team, etc. And so making the part of experimental design as easy as possible to make dialectology a bit more feasible. Okay, so what are my research questions going into my study now? One, lexical choices of American youth. Do they indicate maintenance or loss of the traditional lexicon? What is the geolinguistic distribution of these choices? And then what are the factors that condition that? So here's my proposed research context going into this. There's 53 municipalities in Mallorca, municipalities being like counties in the American context. And I sat down and I decided 53 is probably a lot. Let's do 5 counties, 5 municipalities from each of the 6 regions, based more or less on population. And so that's how I created the map on the left, was by looking at the map on the right of population density and seeing more or less if that could be a reasonably representative study of that encompasses all of Mallorca. As of and then as of for participants, this is what I ended up with. So demographics would be younger speakers enrolled in baccalaureate, undergraduate, postgraduate programs on the island. Why younger speakers? I ideally would like to do adults and older individuals, but that was rejected in terms of feasibility. So I decided to focus on younger speakers, being that they represent the future of the island, right? The future of the dialect. If I have to choose one demographic, I chose younger speakers. But in theory, and for really good dialectological studies, you should include multiple different age groups, right? That's obviously ideal. Rationale being, and again, what I just said, so sociolinguistic, and then being an empirical test of existing language documentation, because that's as well, right? So my study itself is not meant to be an initial work of documentation of Majorcan Catalan. It's to test whether or not the existing language documentation is still accurate or not, right? And why that's changed. Recruitment, participants are being recruited from their educational institution, in this case, high schools. I had made a preliminary list of 43 secondary schools, and of course, there's one university on the island. As of today, I've gone to about 20 or so of them. And criteria for participation was that they be from 15 to 24 years old and identify as a speaker of Majorcan Catalan. And I say that very on purpose, and that's what I tell the students when I'm giving presentations, is that in contrast to traditional studies that look at only the purest speakers of a dialect, that speak the most traditional form of a dialect, I want to include speakers of the varied language profiles who speak in various different ways. And so that's why it's sort of self-selected. Do you feel like you're a member of the speech community? If you think you are, great, come on in, and I will, do the test and you can be included in the analysis. I think it's important for a couple of reasons. A, there are traditional speakers, younger speakers who speak still in a very traditional way, but they do not exist in isolation. They interact with people who don't. And so you should include every try and include everyone to offer a more accurate representation of the linguistic reality of the island. And also, since everyone does a language profile, you can isolate out traditional speakers from those who are not, based on social criteria, right? How long they've lived here, etc. So they can be parsed out of the data. It's not like you are including everyone and treating everyone as if they are have been here forever, very Majorcan from generations back, and all speak in the same way. No, they're socially very separated. You can separate them out based on the criteria that they give in their questionnaires. Right. So that was the proposal. So what's happening currently is here's where we're at as of today. In the last 3 months, I've collected data from 47 of the 53 municipalities. I think if I had a week or two more, I could have gotten all of them. Even Escorca, which has 200 residents, I feel like I could have done it. But we'll see. I'm not fully done collecting data. We're going to still, at a distance, try and do some stuff. But 47, of course, not in all equal numbers, but at least a few speakers from each of these municipalities. Number of localities, being right cities, towns, etc., is 80 plus roughly. That I still need to go through the data more, a little more closely, and we'll have to do a lot of research with that, because some students will put maybe their neighborhood instead of the city they live, and all of that being parsed out based on whatever criteria I select. But it's about 80 plus. And participants to date, as of today, is 2,200, so 2,210, which, if you times that by the number of lexical items in each questionnaire, comes out to 349,000 tokens, with an asterisk, because that does not include errors, knockouts, questionnaires that were maybe half done. And by errors, I mean mischaracterizations, right? If they clearly did not name what was in the questionnaire, or false answers, or if they say where you're from, I'm from Hogwarts, that's not going to be included. So the number of tokens will be reduced, but in general, probably around 300,000. So data collection. How are data collected? Or how are data being collected? And this is what I already went over. There's a written dialect questionnaire, that's getting your lexical data, and there's a bilingual language profile, which fits the sociolinguistic data. The tests on average take about 35 to 40 minutes to complete, and data is collected using Qualtrics, which is online survey software that works relatively well. Of course, this could all be done as well in a Google form, probably more rudimentarily. Yes, and in other ways. Qualtrics, I think, is a nice survey software to do so. Okay, so what's my written dialect questionnaire? What does it look like? There's 158 items total, and there's 10 items per semantic field. And I chose eventually, so at the end of it, 13 semantic fields. And that's clothing, elements of nature, food, parts of the house, etc. Those were ones that I found in existing literature done by Esteve Valls, who's done some recent dialectological work. It corresponds to open response questions and picture descriptions, and then there's a word recognition task. In making this questionnaire, I did it in this way. I consulted the sources, which in this case were a couple different either dictionaries, linguistic atlases, or recuis, right, dialect descriptions. And as a control of the words that I picked out, to make sure that those were of the dialect in question, actually associated with Majorcan Catalan, were checked along with the Diccionari Català Valencià Balear, and then the Diccionari de la Llengua Catalana as well, to make sure that they were A, not standard, and B, actually associated with Majorcan Catalan. As for the language profile, I chose the bilingual language profile, which is a standard language profile form created by Birdsong, Gherkin, and Amengual that exists in a variety of language pairs. And I, of course, chose the one that works for Catalan and Spanish. It's a series of scaled response questions to measure language dominance, and it goes through those few sections. So demographic information, language history, habitual use, competencies, and then language attitudes. And so data analysis, how will the data be analyzed? In two main ways. So dialectometry and then the mixed fixed variable rules. What's dialectometry? It's essentially dialectology with a computer. That's all it is. It's contemporary quantitative dialectology. And it works on this concept, or hinges on a concept of linguistic distance between language varieties, which is calculated as the mean differences between the variables at two different geographic sites. And that's what it is. And Catalan in general has been studied pretty frequently using dialectometric methods, specifically in Catalonia, Andorra, and Aragon. And the types of dialectometric analysis I'll be using are the following. So that first is multidimensional scaling. And all it does is it takes geographic distance, so physical distance, so these different sites, and linguistic distance, which is linguistic difference, right, between tokens, and it maps them onto each other. And then it gives you this gray box with circles on it. And those are the different localities. It groups them together, clusters them together, and then it also provides a map of that. And so it draws the isoglosses based on the data that's been given, calculating out the mean differences between the data collected at each site. And then it automatically does that for you. So it draws isoglosses. It's like a human drawing isoglosses, but it's the computer doing it based on algorithms. And then as well, cluster analysis. And cluster analysis is what you see at the bottom. And it's using the same data, but it's clustering the sites based on their linguistic similarity. So it creates a probabilistic dendrogram, and it shows you then which of these dialects are the most similar and which are the least similar. And it groups those into dialect areas, which is nice because it gets a way of, what if certain areas that are not geographically close actually speak similarly, and it can show you that. And 3, there will be a bit of a qualitative analysis of certain individual lexical items. That looks like this. This is taken again from Esteve Valls' 2019 La Llengua Escapçada, which was his study of the franja and the maintenance and change of traditional features in the franja. And what you can see here is 2 words. We have tomata and tomaca. And it gives you essentially a frequency map. So the darker the color, the more that word was used in that area, the lighter the color, no. And so it gives you a way of doing essentially qualitative analysis that you can have these maps and you can talk about them qualitatively. It's essentially showing you frequency on a map, which is nice. As for the explicatory angle of the study, I'll be using a mixed effects variable rules analysis. Again, that's rooted in variation of sociolinguistics. And the objective is to determine the effect that multiple factors have on a binary response variable that represents presence or absence of a trait. And I'll be running 3 parallel mixed effects for variable rules analyses that'll determine which linguistic and social factors condition the use of a Majorcan Catalan word, a Central Standard Catalan word, and a Spanish word. Okay, being the possible variable. So that's the dependent variable is language variety. And then independent variables are a whole slew of linguistic and social factors, which are on the screen now. So linguistic, semantic field, which as I discussed before, core versus non-core vocabulary, referent prototypicality. How prototypical is that referent based on a prototypicality scale by Givon? Uniqueness to Majorca, is that word only unique to Majorca, or is it perhaps shared with other non-standard varieties? And then types of linguistic difference between the Majorcan Catalan and standard Catalan word. Is the difference morphological in nature? Is the difference the actual lexeme itself? Is the difference only phonetic? Okay. And then the social factors, those all come from the BLP, and those are listed on the screen. And it's the usefulness of the BLP is that it gives you a lot of factors to work with. Now, limitations of this method, because it's not perfect, is, and especially my specific study in general, is that one, language use changes after high school is a big thing, because the great majority of my participants are from high schools, not from the university, but from high schools. And as Woolard demonstrated in her 2011 longitudinal study, is that language habits and language use change drastically as you age, or can change drastically as you age. And so high school isn't always the best place to find informants, because they exist in a very interesting sociological place, a social place with its own unique pressures. And after you leave high school, those pressures and those social situations change. And so what Woolard found is that in these high schools in Catalonia, speakers who were strongly Spanish dominant and identified with Spanish and used Spanish generally came from Spanish-speaking families, over the course of their life, some of them became Catalan dominant, or at least used Catalan a lot more, due to various reasons, right? Whether that is their work environment, their social environment, their romantic life, where they moved, those circles change as people age. And so how someone is speaking in high school isn't always how they're going to speak for the rest of their life. And that's something that to be taken into account. The other is that words don't exist in isolation, which is a big one, right? So I use a written dialect questionnaire, but the words that I am testing, no one is just saying them in isolation. They exist in context. All languages exist in context. And so supplementing this with interviews, right? Semi-structured sociolinguistic interviews or recorded conversations it would be ideal to test that. Of course, generalizable with a study of an entire lexicon, you can't ensure that certain words will appear in an interview. So in a structured, a written dialect questionnaire is more feasible, but nothing beats a sociolinguistic interview when it comes to sociolinguistics, right? It's the best way to collect data, right? Because it's the most natural form of speech. And the final one is just that the naturalness of the BLP for Catalan Spanish bilinguals. That's been something raised by other authors. Think especially of Sylvia Perpignan, who does acquisition work, who I don't believe uses the BLP anymore, just because it can seem a little awkward for Catalan Spanish bilinguals specifically, who are simultaneous bilinguals from birth generally. And the questions that are asked can sometimes be a little strange. And I've encountered that too in my data collection. And so other language profiles or other ways of collecting that social data might be better. Okay, I'm going to use 4 minutes and then I will finish. I just kind of want to go over some preliminary results. And again, there are not many because I'm still actively collecting data, but there's some interesting things I found. And now I'm going to show you some of the world's worst graphs and tables you've ever seen. These come straight from Qualtrics. I haven't had time to even put them in Excel. I promise in a year, when I have actual results, I will give you the most beautiful graphs. But here's 2 questions from the questionnaire based on language use. The first one being, what in a normal week, what percentage of time do you use the following languages with your friends, being Catalan, Spanish, and other languages? And you can see, interestingly here, there is tendency towards some monolingualism. We can see 100% is very popular, and 100 and 0, but also 90-10. So there's definitely language dominance or a preference towards one or the other, whether that is being Catalan or Spanish. In this case, and how it looks here, Spanish it beats out Catalan if we're looking at that. In that case, it wins out slightly, but it's not fully monolithic in that there is a mix. Generally, I would say probably majority either a 90-10 mix of language practices, right, of language use. So using both Catalan and Spanish. Interesting though, if you go then to family, it is mostly we're looking at mostly monolingual families. And yeah, so you see those high percentages in 0 and 100. And in this case, Catalan, there's certainly more in that one box. But so at home, there seems to be family monolingualism more or less, but with friends, there's at least some variation in how that's happening. Okay. And then one question of language identification, and this is a question from the questionnaire. It says, "Em sent jo mateix quan xerro," right? I feel like myself when I speak, and either Spanish or Catalan being read. It's interesting in this case. Again, generally, both languages are reaching, that same level of identification, but Spanish does win out here quite significantly. So it seems like there are more habitual, or at least Spanish speakers who have Spanish as their language of identification in the sample, which is interesting. And then when you compare that to another question, which is vull que la resta pensi que, so I want everyone else to think that I am a native speaker of Catalan being red, a native speaker of Majorcan Catalan being purple, and a native speaker of Spanish being blue. it's a bit of the same, right? They want to be seen as Spanish speakers as well. But the one that wins out the most is being a native speaker of Majorcan Catalan, which is very interesting. So that has had a very positive response, it seems, even among those who are Spanish dominant, which is interesting. And if that gets into questions of language unity, who knows? But it is an interesting thing. And then I have one lexical example, and this is the end, I do promise. And that is that this is the first thing that's in the questionnaire. It's shorts. And here's a sample of those responses. On the left here is we have what the responses in theory should be, right? So for Mallorcan, you would have calçons or calçons curts, right? Central Catalan would pantalons curts, and then Spanish would have pantalones cortos. And we see a bit of all of that coming in. Calçons and calçons curts, I would say overwhelmingly are still maintained, but there's a good amount of variation, and this represents a good representation of clothing in general. The clothing items have some of the most variation and some of the most influence from other languages. So if we have bermudas as well, we have shorts from English, we have vaqueros and also vaquers. And then pantalons curts and pantalons were used relatively infrequently. So calçons and calçons curts is maintained. So that's one interesting example. It's the first thing in the questionnaire, and there will be a lot of variation in general. But I think impressionistically, I have seen a lot of variation and a lot of change in the classroom when the questionnaires are being taken. But it'll be very interesting to see these results and actually see them correlated with the social linguistic factors. That's it. This is the end of it. In general, I think there's an urgent need for empirical evidence-based lexicography. Majorcan Catalan lexicon, this is the first large-scale dialect survey that uses these specific methods in this specific package. And the ultimate goal is to create an easily reproducible protocol for the study of dialect change that is applicable to a wide range of linguistic features. So not just lexical, it can be done with phonetics and phonology, it can be done with morphosyntax. For example, me and Elga right now are working on modifying this to work for participle agreement in Majorcan Catalan, which is fascinating. So it can work for one feature, it can work on a larger scale, it can work for different levels of language. And that's the idea, is to hopefully make dialectology give some methodological rigor and make it a bit easier for people looking to do it. And thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you very much, James. If there are questions, you can ask them both in English or in Catalan. So, si teniu preguntes, també les podeu fer en català. En James contestarà tant en anglès com en català. You can just raise your hand. I think it will be more comfortable for everyone to be speaking to each other. But if you need to write down them, if you want to write them down, and I will read them aloud, or it's also an option. Sí, podeu aixecar la mà per fer les preguntes, però si les voleu escriure al xat també les llegiré i ja està.